Hello and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. The national debt surpassed $35 trillion this month. That's the amount of money the federal government has borrowed over the years to pay for deficit spending. Interest payments on that debt alone cost taxpayers more than the annual budget for the Department of Defense. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Casey, let's face it, government spending is out of control. Why should Americans be concerned, and why isn't the ballooning debt a significant campaign issue heading into November's presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, Americans should definitely be concerned. It's hard to know when he used the word ballooning, and so I'll continue with that. The debt is ballooning for sure, but the debt's been ballooning for a couple of decades now, and you look around, everything seems fine, but we don't know when that balloon's going to pop. And we have seen some signs of some rumblings of kind of the unprecedented money printing and inflationary activities that the federal government's been engaged in. Prices rose 20% since President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris took office. Americans are feeling the weight of that right now. A lot of economists are celebrating that inflation is down, but just to be clear, what they mean is that inflation is not rising nearly as fast as it did, but prices are still rising. They're just kind of rising at more normal levels now, and they certainly have not gone down to the pre-pandemic or pre-Biden levels. And so, over 20% increase since Biden took office, and some things like groceries and different things are much higher than that, and are still rising much faster than even the normal inflation rate. For instance, chicken and pork rose about 10% in the last year, which is an incredible increase. Is of course a staple that almost all Americans are going to be looking to buy at the grocery store. And so we've seen these kind of rumblings, these moments where the unstable, the cracked foundation that we've created in the economy by the money printing starts to have impact. But for now, the house is still intact, and so the life continues. But if you look at the projections, Dan, from the Congressional Budget Office, it's kind of crazy to see just how the national debt, for instance, is on track to be twice as much as the GDP. Interest payments on the national debt are just a few years away from being the single biggest expense to the federal government, and that number is only going to continue to rise. And so you get to this point, you can imagine. And not the too distant future, where half of the federal budget is just for interest payments. That's not going to happen in the next presidential term, very likely, but it is in the near future. And so I think we have these warning signs we're seeing with inflation, and we saw the market dip a few days last week. But I think it is something voters should be concerned about. But right now, Dan, neither party, Republican or Democrat, seems very concerned about it at all.
Another reason taxpayers should be concerned about it, Casey, is retirement programs such as Social Security and Medicare. They're already just a few years away from near insolvency. As the debt continues to balloon, as the national debt continues its upward pace, are programs like Social Security and Medicare maybe in jeopardy?
Oh, they've been in jeopardy. They're definitely in jeopardy, no matter what any politician tells you. I mean, some hard decisions are going to have to be made in the future to save these programs. Right now, no one has the courage or political will to even cut spending that is not nearly as precious as those programs you laid out, Dan. I mean, they're huge. So, for instance, if you look at the Treasury Department's data laying out the last fiscal year, the deficit so far has been $1.5 trillion. And of that, Social Security is the biggest expense at $123 billion. Then Medicare is $92 billion. And then, Dan, as we said, the third, coming in third is interest on the national debt at $81 billion. And then you get to more things like national defense is $71 billion. Then you go further down, there's things like veterans and education. I mean, we spend $12 billion on education and $81 billion on interest, right? $12 billion on transportation and $81 billion on interest, right? So when you talk, like, we can't, there's no political will or willingness for lawmakers to even trim some of the things like for transportation or education or veterans, health care, national defense. And so when you talk about touching some of these big entitlements that continue to grow or are on the path to insolvency, no, there's no plan. They are in danger. They are going to become insolvent unless something changes. And right now, nothing is changing at all. And any candidate is terrified to even bring it up for fear of immediately losing their election.
Casey, there are really only two ways to address the national debt, or a combination of two things, and that is drastically cut spending or drastically raise taxes. Certainly neither presidential candidate wants to talk about raising taxes, I wouldn't think, particularly in today's economy where you mentioned, inflation has cost more than 20%, are more than 20% higher than when President Biden and Vice President Harris first took office. You add tax increases on top of that. Things are just too expensive as it is. So expense cuts. But no one has the nerve in Congress or the White House to talk about significant expense cuts.
Yeah, I mean, right now both candidates are talking about cutting taxes on tips, which is a very popular policy with a lot of people. Democrats are always talking about raising taxes on the ultra wealthy. And of course, there is probably a little, some revenue to be made there for sure. There are downstream implications of that or consequences of that. If that, can push wealthy people out of the country or out of the state where the taxes are raised. It can disincentivize investment and business growth. And, I think a little bit probably it could be withstood without many ramifications. But if you hiked up taxes, to what we saw maybe, a different era in American politics, where they were like 70% on the ultra wealthy, there's some big consequences for that. And you see that when you raise taxes at that level, you actually collect less revenue. So there is, I think there is more money to be made in raising taxes, of course. But at the current spending levels, Dan, 35 trillion debt, deficits that are regularly over 1 trillion. You can't tax your way out of this problem. It'll help, but the spending right now is so extravagant. It's so unprecedented. Even in modern political history, the spending levels right now are just out of control. It's hard to overstate. For instance, before COVID, Dan, there was no deficits over $1 trillion. It was kind of a red line. The deficit had never been over $1 trillion. And then, during COVID and post-COVID, it's normal. We had $2 trillion deficits, and now we're at 1.5 this year. And so we went from, in the matter of a few years, in the middle of a debt crisis, from 2019 to 2024, we went from the deficit being less than $1 trillion to being over $1.5 trillion, nearing $2 trillion this year.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.